Elliot Hargrave stepped out of his car and adjusted the cuffs of his crisp, tailored suit. The orphanage loomed before him, an old brick building with weathered shutters and an air of forgotten resilience. He donated to places like this countless times before, ensuring that vulnerable children had food, shelter, and safety. But today, as he walked through its gates, something felt different. Inside, the chaos of children's laughter filled the hallways. Elliot's sharp eyes softened slightly as he watched a group of boys chase a ball across the worn linoleum floor. A kind-faced woman greeted him, introducing herself as the director, and led him to a modest common room where a few children were playing quietly. Elliot felt his usual detachment creeping in. He was here to check on the progress of the facility he funded, not to get emotionally involved. Then he saw him. Sitting in the corner, engrossed in a dog-eared book, was a boy who couldn't have been older than 8. His dark, tousled hair and sharp green eyes caught Elliot's attention immediately. Unlike the other children, this boy didn't seem interested in impressing the visiting benefactor. Elliot found himself inexplicably drawn to the child's serious demeanor. "That's Jamie," the director explained, noticing Elliot's gaze. "He's one of our newer arrivals. Very bright, but keeps to himself. He's had a hard time adjusting." Elliot nodded, but before he could respond, Jamie looked up, as though sensing their conversation. Their eyes locked, and for a brief moment, Elliot felt a jolt of something he couldn't quite name. "Do you want to meet him?" the director asked. Elliot hesitated but nodded. As he approached, Jamie stood, clutching the book to his chest. "You're Elliot Hargrave," Jamie stated, not asked, his voice clear and steady. "That's right," Elliot replied, taken aback. Jamie tilted his head, studying him with an intensity that belied his age. "Are you my dad?" The question hit Elliot like a physical blow. He blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. "Why would you think that?" he managed, his tone calm but edged with confusion. Jamie shrugged. "My mom always said my dad was someone important, someone who helped people. And you, well, you look like me." Elliot opened his mouth to respond but found himself speechless. The boy wasn't wrong. There was a resemblance, subtle, but undeniable. Before he could gather his thoughts, Jamie turned back toward his corner, as if the conversation had already served its purpose. The director, clearly embarrassed, tried to redirect the conversation, but Elliot waved her off. "It's fine," he said, though his heart was pounding. The rest of the visit passed in a blur. Elliot found himself distracted, replaying Jamie's question over and over. By the time he returned to his car, the boy's words had rooted themselves in his mind, refusing to let go. Later that evening, as he sat in his expansive but empty home, Elliot poured himself a glass of scotch. He rarely allowed himself to dwell on the past. His life was meticulously compartmentalized. But now, fragments of memories surfaced unbidden. 9 years ago, there had been a woman, Mia, a fiery, passionate whirlwind of a person who had challenged Elliot in ways no one else ever had. Their time together had been brief but intense, filled with laughter, arguments, and a deep connection that scared him. And then, as abruptly as she'd entered his life, she disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye. Just a note saying she couldn't stay. Could Jamie be? No, it was absurd. Coincidental resemblance, nothing more. Yet, despite his logical mind's protests, a nagging voice whispered otherwise. Elliot reached for his phone and hesitated. He'd built his career on uncovering truths others sought to bury. He had the resources to find out everything about Jamie's past. But did he really want to? In the end, curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, won out. He made a call to his private investigator, instructing him to dig into Jamie's background. As he hung up, Elliot felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. For years, he'd convinced himself that the past was buried. But now, with one child's innocent question, the earth was shifting beneath his feet. The memory of Jamie's piercing green eyes lingered as Elliot stared into the night. Somewhere, answers awaited him, and with them, the possibility of something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. "Are you my dad?" Jamie's voice echoed in his mind. For the first time in years, Elliot felt something stir within him, something he couldn't ignore. Elliot sat in his office the next morning, trying to focus on a complicated corporate case, but his mind kept drifting back to Jamie. The boy's question had shaken something loose inside him, a crack in the carefully constructed armor he'd worn for years. He leaned back in his leather chair, staring out the window at the city skyline, but all he could see was Jamie's face. The phone on his desk rang, snapping him back to reality. It was Victor, his private investigator. "I found something," Victor said, his voice steady as always. "The boy's mother is Mia Campbell. She disappeared 8 years ago." "Say Mia, right?" Elliot's breath caught. He gripped the edge of his desk. "Yes, that's her. She lived in Baltimore for a while after leaving New York, working odd jobs under the radar. Had a son, no father listed on the birth certificate. Looks like she moved around a lot after that, never staying in one place long. A few months ago, Jamie was placed in the state's care after well, it's unclear what happened to her. But it doesn't look good." Elliot's heart sank. "What do you mean, it doesn't look good?" "There's no death certificate, but there's no record of her either. No bank activity, no medical records. It's like she vanished." Elliot felt a strange mix of anger and guilt boiling inside him. He'd thought about Mia so many times over the years, wondering where she'd gone, why she'd left. But now, knowing she'd been struggling, possibly in danger, while raising his child, if Jamie was his child, filled him with a deep ache. "Victor," Elliot said after a long pause, "can you confirm if Jamie is mine? I've already taken the liberty of arranging a DNA test. We'll know in a few days." Elliot didn't respond right away. He was grateful for Victor's efficiency, but the reality of what he was about to uncover left him feeling unmoored. "Thanks," he said finally and hung up. Over the next few days, Elliot found himself drawn back to the orphanage. Officially, he told himself he was there to check on the facilities and see how the children were being cared for. But deep down, he knew he wanted to see Jamie again. Each time, the boy was there, watching him with the same sharp, searching gaze. And each time, Elliot felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier. On his third visit, Jamie approached him. "You're back," the boy said simply. "I am," Elliot replied, unsure what to say next. Jamie tilted his head, studying him. "You don't have kids, do you?" The question caught Elliot off guard. "No, I don't," Jamie shrugged, as if the answer confirmed something he already suspected. "If you did, you'd be better at this." Elliot laughed, surprised by the boy's bluntness. "Better at what?" Jamie gestured vaguely. "Talking. You're kind of awkward." Elliot couldn't argue. He wasn't used to being around children, let alone one as perceptive as Jamie. Fair point. They stood in silence for a moment before Jamie spoke again. "Why do you keep coming here?" The question was straightforward, but it carried a weight that Elliot wasn't ready to unpack. "I want to help," he said finally. "That's why I support places like this." Jamie narrowed his eyes. "People like you don't help kids like me for no reason. You're too rich." Elliot was taken aback by the boy's cynicism, but he couldn't blame him. Jamie's life hadn't given him many reasons to trust anyone. "Maybe you're right," Elliot admitted. "But maybe I just think you deserve better than this." Jamie didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost vulnerable. "Sophie deserves better too." "Sophie?" Elliot asked. Jamie's expression softened slightly. "She's my best friend. She's like my sister. They're going to send her to another place soon." "She doesn't want to go." Elliot's chest tightened. He'd heard stories about children in the system being separated from their friends, but seeing the pain in Jamie's eyes made it personal. "I'll see what I can do," Elliot said, surprising even himself with the promise. Jamie nodded, as if that was enough for now. "Thanks." Later that evening, Elliot's phone buzzed. It was a message from Victor. "DNA results are in. Jamie is yours." Elliot stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He'd suspected, of course, but seeing the confirmation in black and white made it real. Jamie was his son. The revelation brought a wave of emotions: relief, guilt, fear, and something he hadn't felt in years: hope. But along with hope came questions. Why hadn't Mia told him? What had happened to her? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do now? Elliot knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away. Not now. The next day, he went back to the orphanage. He found Jamie in the same corner, reading another battered book. This time, Elliot sat down beside him. "Jamie," he said, his voice steady but kind. "I need to tell you something." The boy looked up, his green eyes guarded but curious. "I've been looking into your past," Elliot continued, "and I found out something important." Jamie frowned, waiting. Elliot took a deep breath. "I'm your father." For a moment, Jamie didn't react. Then he narrowed his eyes, as if trying to gauge whether Elliot was serious. "You don't look like a dad," he said finally, his tone skeptical. Elliot couldn't help but smile at the boy's honesty. "What does a dad look like?" "I don't know," Jamie admitted. "But not like you." Elliot's smile faded. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you before. I didn't know." Jamie looked away, his small shoulders tense. "That doesn't change anything." Elliot felt a pang of sadness. He hadn't expected Jamie to accept him right away, but hearing the boy's distrust hurt nonetheless. "Maybe not," Elliot said softly, "but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Jamie didn't respond, but the slight quiver in his lip told Elliot that his words had hit home. As Elliot left the orphanage that day, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Elliot spent the following days trying to navigate the new reality of being a father. He couldn't simply step into Jamie's life and expect everything to fall into place. The boy was cautious, guarded, and rightfully so. Elliot understood that Jamie had been let down too many times to believe in promises, especially from someone like him, a stranger who claimed to be his father after years of absence. But Elliot wasn't deterred. He was determined to prove himself, not through grand gestures or declarations, but through quiet, steady actions. He started small, visiting Jamie daily and spending time with him in the orphanage's modest library. They didn't talk much at first, and Jamie kept his answers short and to the point. But Elliot noticed the way Jamie's posture softened, just slightly, whenever he walked into the room. One afternoon, Elliot brought a chess set with him. He set it up on a small table, catching Jamie's attention. "You play?" Jamie asked, eyeing the board. "I do," Elliot said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Want to try?" Jamie hesitated, but eventually sat down. "I've never played before." "That's all right," Elliot said with a small smile. "I'll teach you." As they played, Elliot explained the rules, his voice calm and patient. Jamie picked up the game quickly, his sharp mind grasping the strategy almost instantly. By the third game, he was already challenging Elliot's moves with surprising confidence. "You're good at this," Elliot said, genuinely impressed. Jamie shrugged, though there was a flicker of pride in his expression. "It's just a game." "Maybe," Elliot said, moving his knight, "but it shows how you think. You're smart, Jamie. Smarter than I was at your age." Jamie looked up at him, skeptical. "You don't seem like you were ever my age." Elliot chuckled. "Fair enough. It feels like a long time ago." Jamie didn't say anything more, but he didn't get up either. They finished their game in companionable silence, and for the first time, Elliot felt like he'd made real progress. That evening, Elliot sat in his home office, staring at the folder Victor had sent him. It contained everything about Jamie's life. His birth, the years he spent moving from place to place with Mia, and finally, his arrival at the orphanage. But there was one part that gnawed at Elliot, the unanswered question of Mia's disappearance. Victor's report suggested that Mia might still be alive, but the details were murky. There were hints that she'd been running from something, or someone. A few police reports hinted at threats against her, but nothing concrete. Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something he needed to uncover for Jamie's sake as much as his own. The next morning, Elliot met with Victor in person. They sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, the hum of conversation providing a discreet background to their discussion. "I need you to dig deeper," Elliot said, sliding the folder back across the table. "Find out what happened to Mia. I don't care how long it takes or how much it costs." Victor nodded. "I'm already on it. But I have to warn you, Elliot, whatever she was involved in, it wasn't small. If she's still alive, she's staying hidden for a reason." "I don't care," Elliot said firmly. "I need to know the truth." As the investigation continued, Elliot focused on Jamie. He arranged for Sophie to stay at the same orphanage, using his legal expertise to navigate the red tape and ensure the two children wouldn't be separated. When he told Jamie the news, the boy's reaction was subtle, a small nod, a quiet thanks. But Elliot saw the relief in his eyes. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Jamie began to open up. He started asking Elliot questions about his life, his work, and even his childhood. Elliot answered honestly, sharing pieces of himself that he rarely talked about. He told Jamie about growing up in a small town, about the mentors who'd inspired him to become a lawyer, and even about his love for classic literature, a passion he discovered after reading his first copy of To Kill a Mockingbird in high school. Jamie listened intently, occasionally asking questions or offering his own observations. One evening, as they sat in the library, Jamie surprised Elliot with a question of his own. "Why didn't you come looking for me?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Elliot felt the weight of the question settle over him. He took a deep breath, meeting Jamie's gaze. "I didn't know you existed," he said honestly. "If I had, things would have been different." Jamie looked down at the chessboard in front of them, his fingers idly tracing the edge of a pawn. "My mom said my dad wasn't ready to be a dad. That's why she left." Elliot's chest tightened. "She never told me she was pregnant," he said, his voice thick with regret. "If she had, I would have done everything I could to be there for you." "I'm sorry, Jamie. I'm so sorry." Jamie didn't respond right away. When he finally looked up, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the beginning of understanding. "You can't change the past," Jamie said simply, "but you can't mess this up now." Elliot nodded, his throat tight. "I won't." The moment hung between them, fragile but significant. For the first time, Elliot felt like they were truly beginning to bridge the gap between them. As the days went on, Elliot threw himself into building a future for Jamie and Sophie. He began the process of gaining custody, using every resource at his disposal to ensure the children would never have to worry about being uprooted again. But even as progress was made, there was a shadow lingering in the background. Mia. The search for her continued, and with each passing day, Elliot felt the tension mounting. He couldn't shake the feeling that finding her was the key to understanding everything, and to giving Jamie the answers he deserved. Elliot was growing used to his new routine, visits to the orphanage, spending time with Jamie and Sophie, and the ongoing legal work to ensure they stayed together. Yet, every step forward with Jamie felt like walking a tightrope. Trust was fragile, and Elliot knew one wrong move could shatter it. One afternoon, as they sat outside on a patch of grass near the orphanage's garden, Jamie asked, "Do you think my mom's dead?" The question was so abrupt it left Elliot momentarily speechless. Jamie, however, wasn't looking for an answer right away. His eyes were fixed on a distant point in the sky, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," Elliot said honestly, "but I'm trying to find out." Jamie turned to look at him, his green eyes sharp and searching. "Why do you care now? You didn't care before." Elliot felt the familiar sting of guilt. "Because I didn't know before," he said softly, "but I care now. More than anything." Jamie seemed to consider this, his face betraying no emotion. "You're not like her," he said after a moment. "She was loud, always laughing, always telling stories. You're quiet, serious." Elliot smiled faintly. "She always said I was too serious. Said I needed to loosen up." Jamie's lips twitched, almost a smile. "She said you were boring?" Something like that. For the first time, Elliot saw a hint of amusement in Jamie's expression, and it warmed him. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. The next morning, Elliot received a call from Victor. The investigator's tone was uncharacteristically grave. "I've got something," Victor said. "It's not definitive, but it's big." Elliot leaned forward in his chair, his heart pounding. "Go on." "There's a woman matching Mia's description living in a small town in West Virginia. She's going by a different name, but there's a record of her being hospitalized under her real name about 6 months ago. It was brief. She left before they could follow up, but it's her." "I'm sure of it." Elliot felt a rush of relief mixed with unease. "Why would she be hiding in West Virginia?" "Hard to say," Victor replied, "but I've been digging into the threats she reported before she disappeared. It looks like she stumbled onto something dangerous, something involving a corrupt group of people with serious resources. She might still be running from them. Elliot's jaw tightened. I need to find her. I can give you the address where she was last seen, Victor said. But if you go, be careful. If she's still in danger, you might be walking into a mess. Elliot nodded, though Victor couldn't see him. Send me the details. That evening, as Elliot prepared to leave, he hesitated. Telling Jamie felt like the right thing to do, but he wasn't sure how the boy would react. In the end, he decided to keep the trip quiet for now. If he found Mia, he could bring her back to Jamie. Until then, he didn't want to raise the boy's hopes unnecessarily. Elliot drove for hours, the roads growing narrower and the scenery more rural as he approached the small town Victor had pinpointed. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where strangers stood out. He kept his head down, asking subtle questions at a diner and a gas station, piecing together clues about Mia's whereabouts. Eventually, he found himself outside a rundown house on the edge of town. The yard was overgrown, and the paint was peeling, but the place didn't look abandoned. Elliot parked his car and approached the door, his heart pounding. He knocked twice, the sound echoing in the quiet evening air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door creaked open, just a crack. A woman's face appeared, gaunt and tired, but unmistakably Mia's. Her eyes widened in shock as she recognized him. "Elliot," she whispered, her voice trembling. Elliot felt a flood of emotions: relief, anger, confusion. "Mia, it's me." She opened the door further, stepping out onto the porch. She looked different, thinner, older, worn down, but she was still Mia. The fiery spirit he remembered flickered faintly in her eyes, though it was dulled by years of hardship. "What are you doing here?" she asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I came to find you," Elliot said. "Jamie, he's at an orphanage. He needs you." Her face crumpled at the mention of Jamie, and tears welled in her eyes. "I had no choice," she said, her voice breaking. "They were after us. I had to keep him safe." Elliot stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Who's after you, Mia? What's going on?" Mia hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to appear out of the shadows. "I can't explain it all now," she said, "but they're dangerous. They wanted something I found, a file, evidence of their crimes. I destroyed it, but they didn't believe me. They came after me, after Jamie. I had to disappear." Elliot reached out, his hand brushing her arm. "You don't have to run anymore. Let me help you. Let me protect you and Jamie." Mia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't go back. If they find out I'm alive." "They won't," Elliot said firmly. "I have resources, people who can help. But Jamie needs his mother, Mia. He deserves to know you're alive." Mia's shoulders shook as she sobbed silently. "I wanted to go back for him. Every day, I wanted to. But I was so scared." Elliot pulled her into a gentle embrace, feeling the weight of her fear and regret. "We'll figure this out," he said. "Together." For the first time in years, Mia let herself lean on someone else. And for the first time, Elliot felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Elliot sat across from Mia at the small kitchen table in her rundown house. The room was dimly lit by a flickering bulb, casting uneven shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The air was heavy with unspoken words, and for a moment, neither of them knew where to begin. Mia's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around a chipped coffee mug. She glanced at Elliot, her eyes full of guilt and hesitation. "I thought about telling you," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I found out I was pregnant, I wanted to call you. But then..." She trailed off, and Elliot leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "But then what?" Mia sighed, the weight of her memories pressing down on her. "At first, it was pride. You were building your career, and I didn't want to derail your life. I thought I could handle it on my own. But then, after Jamie was born, everything changed. I stumbled onto something at my job, something dangerous. I couldn't just walk away. They started threatening me, watching me. And when Jamie turned 3, I knew we weren't safe anymore." Elliot frowned. "Who are they? Mia, what exactly were you involved in?" She shook her head. I was working as a legal assistant for a nonprofit that investigated corporate fraud. We uncovered evidence of embezzlement tied to a powerful company, one that had friends in all the wrong places. I found emails, documents, proof that they were laundering money through shell organizations. When I tried to report it, the threat started. Anonymous calls, people following me. They made it clear that if I didn't hand over everything I had, they'd come after Jamie. Elliot clenched his jaw, a surge of anger rising in him. And the file? The evidence? I destroyed it, Mia said, her voice breaking. I thought it would end there, but they didn't believe me. They thought I'd kept copies or handed it to someone else. So, I ran. I thought I was protecting Jamie, but she looked down, her voice trembling. I failed him. I left him alone. Elliot reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. You did what you thought was best. You kept him alive. And now, we have a chance to fix this. But we have to act fast. Mia looked at him, her expression torn. What do you mean? I have resources, Elliot said. Connections that can help us expose these people and make sure they can't hurt you or Jamie ever again. But first, we need to get you out of here. It's not safe for you to stay. Mia hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes. And Jamie? Does he know about me? Elliot shook his head. Not yet. I didn't want to tell him until I found you. But he needs to see you, Mia. He's been through so much, and he deserves to know that you're alive. Mia nodded slowly, wiping a tear from her cheek. Okay, let's do this. For Jamie. The next day, Elliot arranged for Mia to stay in a safe house outside the city. The journey back was tense, both of them on high alert as they navigated back roads and avoided drawing attention. Elliot's legal team had already started building a case, piecing together everything Mia remembered about the corruption she'd uncovered. But the process was slow, and the threat loomed large. When they arrived, Mia was reluctant to leave the car. She sat in the passenger seat, gripping the door handle tightly, her eyes fixed on the orphanage in the distance. What if he doesn't recognize me? She asked quietly. What if he doesn't want to see me? Elliot gave her a reassuring look. He'll recognize you. And he's been waiting for this moment his whole life, whether he realizes it or not. Mia nodded, drawing a deep breath before stepping out of the car. Together, they walked toward the orphanage. The director greeted them warmly, though her eyes lingered on Mia with a hint of curiosity. Elliot had informed her of the situation in broad strokes, enough to ensure Jamie's safety, but not enough to expose Mia's precarious position. When Jamie appeared in the doorway of the common room, he froze. His eyes widened as he took in the sight of Mia, and for a moment, it seemed like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mom? He whispered, his voice cracking. Mia's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, her hand covering her mouth. It's me, Jamie. I'm here. Jamie ran to her, his small frame colliding with hers as she dropped to her knees and wrapped him in a tight embrace. They clung to each other, both crying, the weight of years of separation finally lifting. Elliot stood back, giving them space, his own chest tight with emotion. I thought you were gone, Jamie said through his tears. They said you left me. I never wanted to leave you, Mia said, stroking his hair. I had to keep you safe. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Jamie pulled back slightly, looking up at her with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Are we going to be a family again? Mia glanced at Elliot, who stepped forward and knelt beside them. We are, Elliot said firmly, and I'm going to make sure nothing separates us again. Jamie looked between them, his guarded expression softening as hope flickered in his eyes. He leaned into Mia's embrace, holding her tightly as if afraid she might disappear again. Elliot watched the scene unfold, his heart heavy with determination. He knew their reunion was only the beginning. The danger Mia faced was still real, and the battle to protect their newfound family was far from over. But in that moment, as he saw Jamie finally smile again, Elliot knew he'd do whatever it took to keep them safe. They had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. The days that followed Jamie and Mia's reunion were a whirlwind of cautious optimism and tense preparation. Mia stayed at the safe house, far enough from the city to remain hidden, but close enough for Elliot to visit daily. Jamie was allowed to spend as much time with her as possible, and the change in him was immediate. The walls he had built over years of abandonment and uncertainty began to crack, revealing glimpses of the hopeful, curious child he had once been. Elliot watched the transformation quietly, his heart both full and heavy. He could see how much Jamie adored Mia, clinging to her like a lifeline. Yet, there were still shadows in Mia's eyes, moments when her smile faltered, and Elliot knew the weight of her past hadn't lifted just because she was reunited with her son. Late one evening, after Jamie had fallen asleep in the cozy living room of the safe house, Elliot and Mia sat across from each other at the kitchen table. A file folder lay between them, filled with notes from Victor and Elliot's legal team. Mia traced the edge of the folder with her finger, her expression somber. "They won't stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not until they're sure I'm not a threat. They won't get the chance," Elliot replied firmly. "We're building a case. My team is working around the clock to expose them, to bring this to the authorities." Mia shook her head, her eyes glistening. "You don't understand, Elliot. These people, they don't care about the law. They have money, power, connections. They've silenced others before. Why would I be any different?" "Because you're not alone this time," Elliot said, leaning forward. "You have me. You have Jamie. We're in this together, Mia." Her lip quivered as she looked away, struggling to hold back tears. "I don't want Jamie caught in the crossfire. He's already been through so much." Elliot reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "We'll protect him. I promise." The determination in his voice seemed to steady her, and she nodded, though the fear in her eyes remained. The following morning, Victor arrived with an update. He carried a laptop and several more files, his expression grim. Elliot, Mia, and Victor gathered in the safe house's small living room, where Jamie sat nearby, pretending to read a book but clearly eavesdropping. "We've confirmed a few key players involved in the threats against Mia," Victor began. "The company she worked for at the time, Davenport Global, has ties to a series of offshore accounts and shell companies used for laundering money. The same executives Mia reported on are still operating, and they've expanded their network." "Names?" Elliot asked, his tone sharp. Victor flipped open a folder and slid it across the table. "The CEO, Mark Ridley, and his inner circle. They've kept their hands clean on paper, but we found enough breadcrumbs to link them to several illegal activities. If we can get one solid witness to testify or uncover physical evidence, it'll be enough to bring them down." Mia frowned, her hands twisting in her lap. "But I destroyed everything. The files, the emails, they're gone." Victor nodded. "Maybe, but we found whispers of backup copies stored on encrypted servers. If we can access them, we might be able to retrieve the proof we need." Elliot leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. What about witnesses? Anyone else who worked at the nonprofit who might corroborate Mia's story? Victor hesitated. There were two others who had access to the same files. One disappeared shortly after Mia went on the run. The other, well, he's still alive, but he's been silent for years. "I don't know if he'd be willing to talk." "Then we find him," Elliot said. "And if he won't talk, we make him see why he should." Mia looked between them, her face pale. "What if we can't? What if they find out we're digging into this and come after us again?" Elliot's gaze softened as he looked at her. "That's why we're doing this carefully. They won't see us coming." The next few days were a blur of preparation and planning. Victor tracked down the surviving witness, a man named Grant Ellis, who had been a data analyst at the nonprofit. Elliot arranged for a secure meeting at a neutral location, and when the day arrived, he and Mia drove together to meet Grant. Grant was a wiry man in his 40s with nervous eyes that darted around the small cafe where they met. He looked like a man who had spent years watching his back, and his reluctance was palpable. "I don't know what you expect me to say," Grant began, his voice low. "I've spent years keeping my head down for a reason. Davenport Global doesn't play games. If they find out I'm talking to you, they won't," Elliot said firmly. "We're taking every precaution, but we need your help. Mia isn't the only one who's suffered because of them. If we can expose what they've done, we can stop them for good." Grant hesitated, glancing at Mia. "You were brave, going to the authorities back then." I wasn't." Mia reached out, her voice gentle. You did what you had to do to survive. But we have a chance now, Grant. A real chance to make this right. For a long moment, Grant said nothing. Then he sighed, his shoulders slumping. I still have access to one of the backup servers. I never told anyone because I was too scared to use it. But if it's still active, it might have what you're looking for. Elliot's eyes narrowed. Can you get us in? Grant nodded reluctantly. I can try. But once we access it, they'll know someone's been digging. It's only a matter of time before they figure out who. Elliot exchanged a glance with Mia. Then we'll have to move fast. This is the break we've been waiting for. As they left the cafe, Elliot felt the weight of the task ahead pressing down on him. They were stepping into dangerous territory, but there was no turning back now. For Jamie, for Mia, and for the chance to finally bring justice to the surface, Elliot was prepared to risk everything. The air inside Elliot's car was heavy with tension as he drove back to the safe house. Mia sat beside him, staring out the window, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her sweater. Neither of them spoke, the weight of their meeting with Grant lingering between them. Elliot's mind raced with plans, contingencies, and the ever-present risk of what they were about to do. He knew they were stepping onto a precarious path, but it wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about protecting Mia and Jamie. That evening, Elliot sat with Jamie while Mia disappeared into her room, clearly needing space to process everything. Jamie was sprawled on the couch, a book open on his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in nearly 10 minutes. Elliot could tell something was on his mind. Are you okay? Elliot asked, breaking the silence. Jamie shrugged, his eyes still fixed on the book. Is my mom going to leave again? The question hit Elliot like a punch to the chest. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. No, Jamie. She's not going anywhere. Neither of us is. Jamie looked up at him, his expression skeptical. You can't promise that. Things always change. Elliot swallowed hard, the boy's words cutting deep. He knew Jamie had every reason to doubt him. You're right, Elliot said after a moment. I can't control everything, but I can promise that I'll do everything in my power to keep you and your mom safe. I'm not going to let anything happen to either of you. Jamie studied him for a long time, his green eyes searching. Finally, he nodded, though his face remained serious. Okay, it wasn't much, but Elliot took it as a small step forward. The next day, Victor arrived with a laptop and a portable hotspot, ready to set up the secure connection they'd need to access Grant's server. The safe house became a hive of quiet activity as Victor worked. Mia watched anxiously, and Elliot reviewed the files they already had. Jamie stayed in the background, sensing the seriousness of the situation but keeping to himself. By late afternoon, Victor had established a connection to the server. Grant joined them via a secure video call, walking them through the login process. Everyone held their breath as the screen flickered, lines of code scrolling rapidly before revealing a treasure trove of files. Mia gasped softly as familiar file names appeared, the evidence she thought had been lost forever. This is it, Grant said, his voice tense through the call. But we need to be fast. The moment we start downloading, they'll know someone's breached the server. Elliot nodded. Do it. Victor began transferring the files to an encrypted drive, his fingers flying over the keyboard. The room was silent except for the hum of the computer. Mia stood behind him, her hand pressed to her mouth as she watched the progress bar inch forward. Elliot stood beside her, his posture tense. As the download reached 75%, the screen flashed red, and an alarm sounded from the laptop. They've detected us, Victor said sharply. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they trace this. Elliot cursed under his breath. Can you finish the download? I'm trying, Victor replied, his voice steady despite the urgency. But if they trace this back to Grant, they won't. Grant interrupted over the call. I'm shutting down my end as soon as you're done. Just get the files. Elliot glanced at Mia, who looked pale but determined. We're almost there, he said softly, trying to reassure her. Finally, the download completed, and Victor disconnected from the server. He began wiping traces of their activity, his focus unwavering. When the screen went dark, everyone let out a collective breath, though the tension in the room remained. We've got what we need, Victor said, holding up the encrypted drive. But they know someone's been in. It won't take them long to figure out who. Elliot nodded, his mind already racing. We need to move fast. I'll take the files to my team and start building the case. Mia, you and Jamie stay here. Victor, make sure this location is secure. Mia's eyes widened. What if they come here? They won't, Victor said firmly. Not yet. They'll focus on figuring out who breached the server first. Elliot placed a reassuring hand on Mia's shoulder. You'll be safe. I promise. Despite his calm tone, Elliot felt a knot of worry tightening in his chest. He knew they were running out of time, and the danger was closer than ever. That night, Elliot drove into the city, his mind racing as he considered the next steps. The files they'd retrieved were damning. Financial records, emails, and internal memos that painted a clear picture of Davenport Global's corruption. But exposing such a powerful company wouldn't be easy. They needed airtight evidence, a solid strategy, and the element of surprise. When he arrived at his office, he met with his most trusted colleagues, carefully explaining the situation and entrusting them with the files. They worked late into the night, poring over the evidence and drafting a plan to present it to federal authorities. Elliot knew they only had one shot, and they couldn't afford any mistakes. As the sun rose, Elliot returned to the safe house, exhausted but resolute. Mia greeted him at the door, her face etched with worry. Did it work? She asked. Elliot nodded. We've got a strong case. Now we just have to get it into the right hands. Mia exhaled shakily, her relief palpable. Thank you, Elliot, for everything. He reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. We're not done yet, but we're getting there. As they stepped inside, Elliot saw Jamie sitting on the couch, waiting for him. The boy's eyes lit up slightly at the sight of him, and Elliot felt a surge of determination. No matter what it took, he would see this through to the end. For Jamie, for Mia, for the family they were finally beginning to rebuild. The following days were a blur of cautious activity as Elliot's legal team prepared to move forward with the evidence. Each passing hour felt heavier, the tension in the air at the safe house almost tangible. Mia tried to stay occupied, helping Jamie with his schoolwork and cooking meals in the small kitchen, but her nervous glances toward the windows betrayed her unease. Elliot, though calm on the surface, was deeply aware of the risks they faced. Davenport Global had the resources to strike back if they discovered how close their enemies were to dismantling their operations. Every step needed to be precise, every move calculated. One morning, Victor arrived at the safe house, his expression grim as he handed Elliot a tablet. They're escalating, he said. My sources tell me Davenport has hired a private security team. These guys aren't amateurs. They're tracking whoever breached the server. Mia froze at the doorway, her eyes widening. Do they know it was me? Not yet, Victor replied, glancing at her. But it's only a matter of time. We need to stay ahead of them. Elliot nodded, his jaw tightening. We're close to filing the case with the federal authorities. If we can get the evidence into their hands, it'll force Davenport onto the defensive. But until then? Mia asked, her voice trembling slightly. Until then, we stay vigilant, Elliot said. I've doubled the security around the safe house. Nobody's getting in here without us knowing. Mia nodded, though the fear in her eyes didn't fade. Jamie, who had been sitting quietly at the kitchen table, looked up from his book. Are the bad guys coming for us? He asked, his voice steady despite the tension around him. Elliot crouched beside him, meeting his gaze. No one is coming for you, he said firmly. I promise you're safe here. Jamie studied him for a moment before nodding, though Elliot could see the unease lingering behind his green eyes. It was a stark reminder of just how much the boy had been through, and how much Elliot was determined to protect him from. Later that evening, Elliot and Mia sat together in the living room after Jamie had gone to bed. The room was dimly lit, the faint hum of the security monitors in the background. Mia was holding a cup of tea, but her hands trembled as she brought it to her lips. I can't stop thinking about what happens if this doesn't work, she said quietly. If they find us before we expose them. Elliot reached over, taking her hand in his. It's going to work, he said, his voice steady. We've come too far to fail now. And you're not alone in this, Mia. You have me. You have Jamie. We're stronger together. Mia's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away. I spent so many years running, hiding. I thought I was protecting Jamie, but all I did was leave him vulnerable. I'm so scared of failing him again. You didn't fail him, Elliot said firmly. You made sacrifices to keep him safe. And now, we're fighting for him together. That's what matters. Mia turned to him, her tears spilling over. Thank you, she whispered, for not giving up on us. Elliot squeezed her hand, his resolve hardening. I'll never give up on you. The next day, Elliot received word from his legal team that the evidence had been submitted to federal authorities. The case was now in the hands of the Department of Justice, and while there was still a long road ahead, it was a significant step forward. Elliot shared the news with Mia, who let out a shaky breath of relief. But their relief was short-lived. That evening, Victor called with an urgent update. They figured it out, Victor said, his voice sharp over the line. Davenport knows Mia was behind the server breach. They've tracked her to the general area. It won't be long before they find the safe house. Elliot felt a cold knot form in his stomach. How much time do we have? Maybe a day, 2 at most, Victor said. I'm working on moving you to a secondary location, but we need to act fast. Elliot ended the call and immediately turned to Mia. We need to leave, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mia nodded, her fear evident but her resolve clear. What about Jamie? We'll all go together, Elliot said. Victor's arranging a new safe house. We'll be out of here before they get close. Within hours, they were packed and ready to go. Jamie clutched a small backpack filled with his belongings, his expression serious but calm. Elliot couldn't help but feel a swell of pride at the boy's quiet strength. As they loaded into the car, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The dark road stretched out before them, empty and quiet, but every shadow felt like a threat. Victor led the way in a separate vehicle, guiding them toward the new location. Halfway there, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, growing closer at an alarming speed. Elliot's pulse quickened as he realized they were being followed. Mia, he said, his voice low and urgent. Hold on to Jamie. This might get rough. Mia turned, her eyes widening as she saw the approaching vehicle. Elliot, what's happening? They found us, Elliot said, gripping the wheel tightly. But they're not going to stop us. He pressed the accelerator, the car surging forward as he maneuvered through the winding roads. The vehicle behind them matched their pace, its headlights glaring in the mirror. Mia held Jamie close, her arms wrapped protectively around him as Elliot focused on keeping them ahead. Suddenly, Victor's voice crackled over the car's radio. Elliot, take the next left. It's a narrow road, but it leads to a checkpoint I've set up. They won't follow you there. Elliot didn't hesitate. He turned sharply, the car bouncing slightly as they veered onto a gravel road. The pursuing vehicle hesitated, its headlights swerving before disappearing into the distance. They reached the checkpoint minutes later, where a team of security personnel awaited them. As they stepped out of the car, Elliot felt a wave of relief. For now, they were safe. But as he looked at Mia and Jamie, their faces pale with fear, Elliot knew the fight wasn't over. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had his determination. He would see this through, no matter what it took. For his family, for their future, for the chance to finally give them the peace they deserved. The checkpoint was a small but secure cabin nestled deep in the woods. Victor's team had set it up as an emergency fallback, equipped with surveillance cameras, secure communication lines, and enough supplies to last for weeks if needed. Elliot, Mia, and Jamie were ushered inside quickly, where they were greeted by 2 members of Victor's security team. A tall man with a stern face and a woman with a sharp, calculating gaze. Let us handle the perimeter, the man said, nodding toward Victor. We'll make sure no one gets close. Elliot gave a curt nod in return, pulling Mia and Jamie further inside. He crouched down to Jamie's level, placing his hands gently on the boy's shoulders. Are you okay? He asked, his voice calm despite the tension in the room. Jamie nodded, though his eyes betrayed his lingering fear. I'm fine, he said quietly. Is Mom okay? Elliot glanced at Mia, who stood nearby, her arms wrapped around herself. She's okay, Elliot assured Jamie. We're all okay, and we're going to stay that way. Jamie studied his father's face for a moment before nodding again. Elliot gave him a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder before standing and walking over to Mia. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with worry. "Do you think they'll find us here?" she asked in a hushed tone. Elliot shook his head. "Not likely. Victor's team knows what they're doing. But even if they do, we're ready for them." Mia nodded, but her unease didn't fade. She looked toward Jamie, who had settled onto a small cot with a book. "He's been through so much," she murmured. "I just want this to be over." "It will be," Elliot said firmly. "We're close, Mia. The case is with the DOJ now. Davenport's people are scrambling, and they're getting desperate. That's why they're chasing us so hard. They know their time is running out." Mia nodded again, though the fear in her eyes lingered. Elliot couldn't blame her. The events of the past few days had pushed all of them to their limits. But as he looked at her, then at Jamie, he felt his resolve strengthen. They had come too far to back down now. That night, the cabin was eerily quiet. Victor and his team kept watch outside, their radios crackling softly with periodic updates. Inside, Jamie had fallen asleep on his cot, clutching the book he'd been reading. Mia sat in a chair by the window, staring out into the darkness, while Elliot paced near the small fireplace. Suddenly, Victor stepped inside, his expression tense. "We've got movement," he said. "2 vehicles, about a mile out. They're coming this way." Elliot straightened, his muscles tensing. "How long?" 10 minutes, maybe less," Victor replied. "We're ready for them, but I need you to stay inside with Mia and Jamie." Elliot nodded, turning to Mia. "Stay with Jamie. Don't leave the cabin unless I tell you to." Mia's eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. "What about you?" "I'll be right here," Elliot said, his voice steady. "Victor's team knows what they're doing. We're not letting them get anywhere near you or Jamie." Mia hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Elliot placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze before stepping toward the door with Victor. Outside, the air was crisp and cool, the forest alive with the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. The security team was positioned strategically, their weapons at the ready. Elliot stood beside Victor, his eyes scanning the dark road ahead. As the first set of headlights appeared in the distance, Elliot felt his pulse quicken. The vehicle slowed as they approached the cabin, their engines rumbling ominously. Then they stopped, and the lights went out. For a moment, everything was still. Then a voice called out from the darkness. "Elliot Hargrave," the man said, his tone calm but cold. "We know you're in there. Let's talk." Elliot exchanged a glance with Victor, who gave a subtle shake of his head. "They're stalling," Victor murmured, "trying to buy time or draw you out." Elliot took a deep breath, his mind racing. He knew better than to engage directly, but he also knew they wouldn't leave without a fight. "What's the plan?" he asked Victor. "We hold our ground," Victor replied. "If they make a move, we stop them." The standoff stretched on, the tension thick in the air. Then, suddenly, one of the vehicles roared to life, its headlights blazing as it accelerated toward the cabin. Victor's team responded immediately, their weapons firing precise bursts to disable the vehicle. Tires screeched as the car swerved and came to a stop just yards from the cabin. The second vehicle's occupants emerged, weapons drawn, but they were quickly subdued by Victor's team. Within minutes, the scene was under control, and the intruders were disarmed and restrained. Elliot exhaled a shaky breath, the adrenaline coursing through him. Victor approached him, his expression grim. "We'll question them, but they're just hired muscle. The real threat is still out there." Elliot nodded, his jaw tightening. "We'll deal with it. But for now, we need to focus on keeping Mia and Jamie safe." Back inside the cabin, Elliot found Mia and Jamie huddled together on the cot. Jamie looked up as Elliot entered, his eyes wide with worry. "Is it over?" Jamie asked. "For now," Elliot said, crouching beside him. "Victor's team handled it. You're safe." Jamie nodded slowly, his small hand gripping Elliot's sleeve. "You didn't let them get us," he said quietly. "I never will," Elliot replied, his voice firm. "That's a promise." Mia reached out, her hand brushing Elliot's arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes shining with gratitude. Elliot looked at her, then at Jamie, and felt the weight of the moment settle over him. They had survived another battle, but the war wasn't over. Still, as he held his family close, he knew they would face whatever came next together. For the first time in years, they had hope, and Elliot was determined to protect it at all costs. The morning came with the first rays of sunlight filtering through the trees, casting a fragile calm over the cabin. Elliot sat at the small table in the kitchen, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. His mind was already racing, thinking through the next steps. Victor's team had stayed on alert throughout the night, ensuring that no further threats approached, but Elliot knew this wasn't over. They had bought themselves time, nothing more. Mia appeared in the doorway, looking exhausted but resolute. She crossed the room quietly, pouring herself a cup of coffee before sitting across from Elliot. For a moment, they simply sat in silence, the weight of everything they'd endured pressing heavily on both of them. "How much longer do you think we have to keep running?" Mia finally asked, her voice soft but steady. Elliot met her gaze, his own expression serious. "Not much longer," he said. "The case is in motion. The DOJ has everything they need to start bringing Davenport down, but we need to stay cautious. Desperate people make dangerous moves." Mia nodded, her hands gripping her mug tightly. "I just want Jamie to have a normal life." "He deserves that." "He will," Elliot said firmly. "Once this is over, we'll make sure he has everything he needs. Stability, safety, a real home." As if on cue, Jamie shuffled into the room, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He climbed into the chair beside Mia, resting his head against her arm. "Morning," he mumbled. "Morning, sweetheart," Mia said, brushing a hand through his messy hair. "Did you sleep okay?" Jamie shrugged. "I guess. Is everything okay now?" Elliot leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "For now, yes. And Victor's team is here to make sure we stay safe." Jamie nodded, his small face serious. "I trust you," he said quietly, his words directed at both his parents. Elliot felt a swell of emotion at Jamie's words. He reached out, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We won't let anything happen to you, Jamie. I promise." The hours that followed were spent in careful preparation. Victor's team worked to fortify their position, while Elliot stayed in constant contact with his legal team. News began to trickle in. Davenport Global was feeling the heat. Federal agents had started investigating key players, and a few lower-level employees were already cooperating, eager to avoid prosecution. The walls were closing in, but as progress was made, so too did the tension rise. That evening, Victor pulled Elliot aside, his expression grave. "They've escalated again," Victor said. "I just got word from my sources. Ridley and his people are planning something big. They're desperate." Elliot felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What kind of plan?" "Not sure yet," Victor admitted. "But we need to be ready for anything." Elliot nodded, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that the final confrontation was drawing closer. He just hoped they were prepared. That night, as the cabin settled into uneasy silence, Elliot stayed awake, reviewing contingency plans and scanning updates from his team. The clock ticked on, each passing minute dragging under the weight of anticipation. Sometime after midnight, a faint sound broke the stillness, the crunch of tires on gravel. Elliot froze, his ears straining. He moved quickly to the window, peering out into the darkness. Headlights approached, cutting through the trees. "They're here," Elliot said, his voice low but urgent. Victor and his team sprang into action, taking up defensive positions. Mia appeared in the hallway, holding Jamie's hand tightly. Her face was pale, but her eyes were filled with resolve. "Stay with him," Elliot told her. "Don't come out no matter what." Mia nodded, pulling Jamie close as she led him back into the bedroom. Elliot turned back to the door, his heart pounding as he prepared for what was coming. The vehicles stopped just short of the cabin, their engines idling. A group of men emerged, armed and clearly ready for a confrontation. One of them stepped forward, his confident stride and expensive suit marking him as Mark Ridley. Even in the dim light, his smirk was visible, radiating arrogance. "Elliot Hargrave," Ridley called out, his voice carrying through the night. "I know you're in there. Let's have a chat, shall we?" Elliot stepped outside, flanked by Victor and two of his guards. He kept his posture steady, his expression calm despite the tension in the air. "There's nothing to talk about," Elliot said evenly. "You're finished, Ridley. The evidence is already with the DOJ. It's over." Ridley chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a smart man, Hargrave, but you've underestimated who you're dealing with. You think your little case will take me down? I've survived worse." Elliot's eyes narrowed. "Not this time. You've made too many enemies, Ridley. You're done." Ridley's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "We'll see about that." Without warning, one of Ridley's men raised his weapon, but before he could act, Victor's team responded with precision. A brief but intense exchange followed, the air filled with the sound of gunfire. Elliot stayed low, his heart pounding as he focused on keeping Ridley's men from getting any closer to the cabin. In the chaos, Ridley made a break for his vehicle, but Victor intercepted him, disarming him with swift efficiency. Within moments, the situation was under control. Ridley and his men were subdued, their weapons confiscated. Elliot stood over Ridley, his expression cold. "It's over," he said again. This time with finality. Ridley sneered but said nothing, his bravado finally cracking as he was dragged away by Victor's team. Back inside the cabin, Elliot found Mia and Jamie waiting for him. Jamie ran to him, throwing his arms around his waist. "Are you okay?" Jamie asked, his voice trembling. "I'm fine," Elliot said, crouching to hug him tightly. "We're all fine." Mia stepped closer, her eyes glistening with relief. "Is it really over?" she asked softly. Elliot nodded, a tired but triumphant smile crossing his face. "It's over." For the first time in what felt like forever, a sense of peace settled over them. They had faced the storm and emerged stronger, a family bound not just by blood, but by the unshakable love that had carried them through. Elliot looked at Mia and Jamie, his heart full. Their journey had been long and fraught with danger, but as they stood together, he knew they had found something worth fighting for, a future they would face together, no matter what came next.